Hello, everyone on Zoom. Hello, everyone not on Zoom. For my folks who are on Zoom, there is a significantly smaller in-person audience here, but they will have a chance to ask questions. I will have a chance to engage with them if they have a burning question in the middle. So if I'm addressing someone, it's them. All right, welcome. Welcome to the Keeping a Logbook presentation, which is actually, oh, will it let me click? We'll have to do that. Keeping a logbook and or a sea journal. If we're going to talk about keeping logbooks, keeping records of a person's time at sea, then we have to think about all the different ways they might do that. And technically speaking, if it's not a strictly ruled and formatted type of log, it technically counts as a sea diary or sea journal. We're going to linger on the definition between these terms and all of the gray area between them today, but I just wanted to be very clear. If you were here for logbooks only, you may now, this is a logbook sea journal presentation. Okay, so what is a logbook anyway? If you think about the age of sail, roughly 1500 to 1900, give or take a couple decades, in the English-speaking world, that's how we're defining the age of sail today. A logbook is the official record of what went on a vessel, where the vessel was, and what was going on around the vessel. We'll look at lots of examples of this soon. But a logbook was often something that wouldn't have someone's personal information in it. The most important thing a logbook could do during this time was keep a record of where the ship had been. This is a time, of course, before GPS, even before Loran. If a vessel wanted to safely navigate, they had to know where they were. And to do that, many vessels would use a combination of dead reckoning and other technologies. Dead reckoning is simply using the very simple distance equals rate times time formula to estimate your position on the watery world using your speed that an analog tool would be used to collect, the time elapsed, and what the wind was doing, because these are, of course, sailing vessels. So our logbooks, in an immediate sense, really just provided a record for everyone on the crew, that is, the literate people on the crew, the officers on the crew who were tasked with keeping and interpreting the logbook. It was a record of where they had been. But it was also a legal document. Whether we're talking about a navy or a merchant service, logbooks were often turned into the boss at the journey's end. So if there was a mutiny on board, if somebody died, if there was anything that needed to be proved in a court of law or for insurance purposes, the logbook was the official place to put it. So these documents are very official. Any document, even one that looks an awful lot like a logbook that strays from this official line, technically qualifies as a sea journal or a sea diary. These are personal accounts, and anybody who could write could keep a sea journal. So logbooks were kept by officers. Typically, the mate on board would be tasked with the actual recording of information that the captain would have oversight of, but sea journals could be kept by anyone of any station, lowly or in charge. So we see a much broader expanse of humans at sea represented in sea journals, and that's why we're talking about both today. The logbooks are really important for getting data. Sea journals are very important for getting human stories, although, as we'll find out, there's still a lot of gray area. So, an illustrative example. On the left, you see an excerpt from a Bath sea captain's logbook, and he was having a bad day. So, this is Captain William Bathley. We'll spend quite a bit of time with him today. And Captain William Bathley was upset because his ship was becalmed. He wrote the word calm approximately 57 times on that logbook page. Now you can see that it is kind of like an Excel spreadsheet of its time. It is ruled with lines printed on the page. They designate specific pieces of data that the captain or mate needs to record, but Captain Bagley, in great frustration, wrote calm all over it because his vessel wasn't going anywhere. He was a merchant captain. He wanted to get back to port and get a good price for his goods and go see his family. He was very frustrated and he just wrote calm about it all over the page. Meanwhile, this same sentiment can be represented in a sea journal quite differently. The young man writing the sea journal to the right was named Horatio N. Haley. He was 25 years old at the time of his voyage, and he was the steward on board a topsail-based vessel. So he didn't have the same worries about trying to harness the wind and get where he needed to go. That was not his job. His job was feeding people. So here's what he said about a calm day. I will be reading all of the text that we see, or at least excerpts of it, for accessibility reasons, but you're welcome to read along too. So, the sails repose in silent rest beside the towering masts. The sea, as far as the eye can stretch, is like a mighty mirror. Not the slightest ripple disturbs its polished surface. No sound comes over its peaceful bosom. H.N. Haley was still kind of getting the spelling down. But he has a much more flowery and kind of personal way of expressing how he felt about this calm day. And as we read these different bits of logbooks and sea journals, we're going to get a sense of how people could express themselves minimally or maximally based on which medium they were writing it. All right, this is one of our Mariners Adventure Campers. We have some really fantastic middle schoolers learning all about the lives of sailors, doing all kinds of cool crafts last week and this week. And one of our campers interpreted William Bagley's super calm logbook page on a very hot and muggy day last week. So I want to take this opportunity to say, when I was given the opportunity to give this lecture, I was excited because this is something that I've been talking to students about for years. I love getting to show students examples of people using their literacy skills to do important things to hopefully inspire them to also want to write about their lives. So even though we have a kind of distressed face in this picture, I was really glad that this student connected to Captain William Bagley's calm crash out. Okay, why is it called a log anyway? It doesn't look anything like a large piece of timber. This tool behind me is called a chip log. You can see the parts of it. There's the part that looks like a wooden Dorito chip. And then there's the part that kind of looks like a log. It's a spool. And this is the speedometer of the age of sail. You need an hourglass too. Really a 14-second glass, or maybe a 30-second glass if you worked on quite so fast a vessel. And sailors would use this to figure out how fast their vessel was moving through the water. That's really important information if you want to use your speed or rate of passage to find out where you'll be in an hour, in a day, in a week. So the log takes its name from this piece of technology, even though logbooks far outlived the use of this thing. We also have some other related pieces of analog technology. The thing that kind of looks like a compass is called a traverse board, and the thing that looks like a slate is called a log slate or a logboard. And these two things were used because you don't always want to have a proper book with paper up on deck exposed to the elements, and your crew might not always be literate. So the traverse board allows any crew member, even one who can't read or write, to record some really important information. We have around the compass 4 to 8, depending on the board, little pegs that can be placed in the slots specifying what time it was and what direction the wind was coming from. And then below, the rate of speed of the ship, which of course you get from the ship log. So after a watch, a navigational watch of perhaps 8 hours, the crew could turn in their traverse boards to the mate, who could record that information in the log. There's no need for the entire crew to be literate when that's a possibility. The logboard or log slate, same deal. It's just a chalkboard that can be erased and reused once the information is recorded in the official log. There were certain services like the British Navy that had very strict rules about what had to go in a logbook. how often it should be recorded, what should definitely not go in a logbook. But because we are in Maine, we don't have any of those logbooks in our collection. I'm going to be sticking to logbooks and sea journals in our collection today. So that does mean that we aren't going to see some of the things that you might be really curious about logbook-wise. For example, those beautifully illustrated whaling logbooks where captains use stamps or lovely and lurid watercolor illustrations of dying whales. We don't have any whaling logbooks here in the Maritime Museum's collection, so we're not going to be talking about those today. Similarly, we don't have any Antarctic exploration or shipwrecked on, some distant coast in the 1500s logbooks. Those simply aren't our bailiwick, but I would encourage you to look into them anyway. We're today just going to be using our collections to talk about logs, and most of these were donated by the families of people who wrote these logs or perhaps private collectors. So most of our logbooks, I'll take a moment before I show you most of our logbooks. We have just a little bit of gray area here, playing fast and loose with the term log. You might be familiar with some of these fabulous books on the screen, but two of them, Logbook for Grace and The Log of a Skipper's Wife, are edited sea journals, and Star of India, Log of an Iron Ship, is simply a popular history book. So just because something says it's a log does not necessarily mean it is. Perhaps that drew some of you here today. Don't worry, we will talk about sea journals. Okay, here are the logs that I've excerpted today. And it was pretty daunting to try and find just an hour's worth of them because there are almost 500 logbooks in Maine Maritime Museum's collections, and many haven't been necessarily digitized, cataloged, studied. We have a wonderful intern, Mara Stahl, who's here this summer, who is trying to get almost 500 logs cataloged before she leaves for the fall. But there are so many that I tried to get just those that had a pretty good track record, that had already been cataloged. Many had already been transcribed. So just know that of the stories we're going to look at, there are many, many, many more that you could look into. We'll talk about that more at the end. But you'll notice the commonalities among all of these logbooks. Mainly, they come from the middle to late part of the 19th century. This makes sense. That was the golden age of Bath ship building and Bath ship owning. So our collection does kind of have a bias for that time and for merchant vessels. That's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. You'll also notice that most of the people here are men. We have one female recorder here. We'll talk about her when we get to her, but we do have officers who are typically white men, overrepresented in terms of being the authors of logs in our collections. So we will try and learn about these people based on the records they left for us. We'll see the information, but also some of the emotion they left. And if you have any questions, be ready to ask them at the end. All right, we're going to start out with this fine vessel behind me, the Levi Sea Wade. This was a Bath-built vessel that regularly did around the world cargo missions, sailing from New England to the South Pacific and back. So this was a circumnavigating vessel. The picture that we'll actually take a look at a bit closer in a moment shows it at the start of the voyage that one of the logbooks we have cataloged. So I originally selected this logbook because not only do we have the logbook, which looks like that, but we have a painting of the start of the voyage. And we also have a picture of the owner. We have a painting of William Bagley. Sorry, not the owner, the captain. So we have a painting of Mr. Captain Bagley, and we really don't have images of any of our other logbook writers that I've selected here. So we know what he looks like, and we actually have 2 logbooks in our collection that chronicle many round the world voyages. And these were donated to the museum by his daughter. So we're going to be focusing just kind of on our logbook format talk on one passage that I kind of picked at random from the many, many, many pages of logbook entries from Captain Bagley. So you'll see that the book that's open behind me has basically 4 days worth of entries on a 2-page spread. Here's the painting. I just love this painting because it's so clearly a vessel arriving in San Francisco. You can see the Farallon Islands out behind it. You can see the Golden Gate out in front of it. And it's very clearly labeled. This is the Levi Sea Wave on that voyage that we're going to read about in 1879. Okay, so here is a logbook page. This is 1 day's entry, and it's pretty typical of what a logbook would say. So I'm sorry you can't see, those of you who are seeing the viewer screen sharing, but it says that they're bound from San Francisco towards Falmouth, England. And then there are all these ruled columns that give basic information. We have 24 hours in 2 sets of 12, just like we have today. We have knots, the speed the vessel is traveling, half knots that we'll talk about in a second. The course the vessel is steering, the winds that are happening. This is not only direction such as southeast, but also whether they are variable, baffling, or, as Bagley told us earlier, calm. And then we have remarks. And remarks are the very interesting part because this is where you might find not only the personality of the person writing, but also anything that doesn't fit those pretty rigid categories. Below, we have spots for the captain or mate, whoever's writing to record the latitude and longitude. Very important. And here are some things that are personal. First of all, Bagley did not use the half-knot column to record half knots. Instead, he used it to write how many miles they'd sailed on the voyage and how many days they were out. So on this particular logbook entry, they're 98 days out of San Francisco, headed for England. He also didn't use the leeway column. Curator emeritus Nathan Lipford says that most merchant captains didn't, even though it was highly recommended by Nathaniel Dodge. No one used the leeway column. They all did something else with it. And Bagley chose to put the barometer reading in it. On such a long voyage in such dangerous waters, it's no surprise that he would choose to monitor the glass as he went. We also have in his writing ND, this means meridian or noon. And it's important to note that logbooks would be kept from noon to noon. Why? That isn't how we think of days today, usually. Anyone have a guess here? Yes. It's when you take your position. So you are going to end the logbook. Actually, it's pretty handy that they put the latitude and longitude here at the very bottom at the end of the day's run, noon. The captain or other officers would hopefully, if the weather cooperated, take a sight of the sun, find their position using celestial navigation, and be able to compare their wind reckoning with where they actually were on the globe. So you'd commence your next day, the hour after, and spend 24 hours getting back to noon when you could reliably take a sun sight. That means that the middle of the day is the middle of the night. Midnight is right here. And sure enough, Captain Bagley says midnight right there. What else does he say? He says, this day begins with light southerly winds, heavy northerly sea with heavy rain. Midnight thick and raining light airs all around the compass. Latter part calm, light rain showers filled up all our water. At meridian or noon, calm and cloudy, so ends this dirty day. And that is our clue. So ends this dirty day, that this is not actually the official ship's log, because that is editorializing. We'll find more examples of this promptly, but Bagley likely kept this log that we have in our collection as a personal log. The one that was kept by the mate, that was an official record that was going to be turned in to the owners of the vessel at the conclusion of the voyage. That probably would not have included an adjective such as dirty to describe this day, nor any of the other personality that Bagley put into this log as he kept it. But why would he call this day dirty? If you read the transcription, you can clearly see that he is struggling. There are heavy northerly seas. They're bashing into it on very light southerly winds. They're not going anywhere. They're 98 days out. They just want to be home and they only go 40 miles, says it right here, in this 24-hour period. So no wonder Bagley was kind of unhappy with the conditions. Where were they? They were off the coast of Brazil. They were doing their best to get back to England. And that kind of makes you wonder, well, what was it like for him rounding Cape Horn? If we look a month and a half back at when he was rounding Cape Horn, he actually shares quite a bit of information that other logbook keepers also found important and put in the remarks section. He talks about what birds they see that were often signs of land or approaching weather, like Cape pigeons and Cape hens. He describes all manner of winds as well as the sails that are set and doused. He says they're making big progress around the Cape. So you can chart an entire voyage this way. That was the entire goal of a logbook. But we start to see more than just observations on weather, on wind, on birds, on progress from Bagley as the log continues. He and his crew made it safely to Falmouth. And soon, in early March, we start seeing mentions of some interesting people. So, sorry, I can't see this, but it comes in with fine west-southwest winds, small southwest swells, weather good, many birds around the ship. Middle part, same weather. Latter part, strong northerly winds, small sea, fine weather, at meridian the same. It's a good day. Strong easterly current, 1.5 knots per hour. Laura, very well this morning, managed to eat a potato for breakfast. And this is when we start hearing a lot about two people in this logbook who are not members of the crew, Laura and Hilda. We see that Laura very well as also the baby. She has a new tooth. And Laura and Hilda, that's the baby, very smart, hoping they will continue. And a longer one. This day begins blowing, thick and rainy. At 6 p.m., the sea was smoother. They set to gallant sails. At midnight, they set all light sail. But through this day, Laura's squealy often this afternoon. Also baby. So as Bagley is charting the weather, as he's charting what's going on the vessel, sometimes thick, rainy, heavy weather, he's also telling us what his wife and infant daughter or I guess, baby daughter are experiencing. And not only does this tell us that this is most certainly a personal log, but it also gives us a really interesting insight into what life was like for these people, for Laura and Hilda. Poor Hilda was teething all throughout this voyage. Imagine being on a vessel for months with a teething baby. If you were crew, you might not be overly pleased. But Laura kept a log as well, or rather, a sea journal, and we also have it in our collections. I was delighted to find this. So these are the recollections, what's coming up, of the wife of Captain William Bagley. She was from a seafaring family as well. She kept her logbook in a seaman's time book. So this was designed to essentially be a medical record and a discharge record for sailors on board. It has a very official set of instructions in the front, but it was used by Laura. You can see it there on the right. It was used by Laura as a diary. No logbook about it, even though she's clearly writing over this ruled table that is trying to get the writer to record very specific information. So this is the same day in May of this voyage. You're going to quickly compare and contrast what this logbook versus sea journal says about the same day. Now, I had to pick May because for about the first 2 months of the voyage, they left in early March, Laura was seasick. She was very, very seasick. We know this because, her sea journal began on a Cunard Line steamer, much smoother, going across to England, and then cuts out for weeks at a time, while in Captain Bagley's log, every entry ends with Laura's seasick. Laura is still seasick. And then finally, when she eats that potato, comes back to life, we start getting long entries from her. So, on this day, May 8th, Laura's talking about a number of things. She starts with the latitude and longitude, something that matches what William wrote about in his log. Did they fill up their logs together? She talks about what vessels they see, seeing whales, seeing birds, Cape pigeons, albatrosses, Mother Carey's chickens. She talks about Hilda getting very excited over these birds. She also gives us a teething update. And here are the similarities between this sea journal and the logbook. They, of course, both talk about position, the most important thing a logbook can have. They also both note birds, only the albatross, one large albatross that someone will preserve for Laura, makes the logbook. And then they both have updates on Laura and Hilda's well-being. So these are the same day from a married couple, just one's a sea journal, one's a logbook. We also have some much more emotional passages from Laura, who generally wrote a very log-like journal. She primarily talked about the weather, the conditions, what it was like, what they saw. But sometimes she reflected a little bit, like this Christmas logbook entry when she talks about there in the South Pacific at this point. She talks about how warm it is, 86 degrees in the cabin. She's so glad it's almost over. The sailors had a holiday. There's a Sunday stillness on board all day. If I could only look in at home and see how it is there, I hope we shall be down to the Cape by 1 week from tonight. So sea journals often give us a much closer look into the emotions a person was experiencing at the time. And this is on the same Christmas. This is what William wrote about Laura. He said she was sitting on the sofa mending her clothes for a change, because poor Laura was typically mending clothes for him, for the crew, for Hilda. Poor Laura, finally taking some time for herself, sitting on the sofa on Christmas, just wishing she was home. One last entry from Laura. This is about a huge storm, a typhoon, perhaps bound from Bangkok to Falmouth after making landfall and exchanging cargo in the South Pacific. At this point in the voyage, a year on, Laura has a great grasp of what it means to be a sailor, even though she's clearly bound to the deck. She's talking about how they hove to under the main topsail and reefed spanker, all of the sails they set and doused, recording the barometer, fearful squalls and rain, and then also takes a note to say, well, yesterday was Inauguration Day back in the US, and we don't know who the president is, because it's been a year since she had been home. But we'll leave the Bagleys there for now. We'll return to them briefly at the end. And go back to Horatio and Kaylie, that 25-year-old young man. He was the son of Bowden. He went to sea as steward. And his journal, since he was not the captain, an officer, a sailor, or the wife of one of those, his journal really goes far into the territory of this is a sea journal. So he was aboard the ship N. Larrabee, flag out of tops'l, and he kept his logbook in kind of like a blank paper book. There's no paste cover like many logbooks have. However, it's very likely that Kaylie rewrote his log upon return to shore. Most of his entries are just very long paragraphs that describe an entire week or the entire visit at a certain port. And he was not necessarily paying attention to the things most logbooks or sea journals address. Kaylie was very musical, and he was homesick almost immediately. On the Wednesday before they sailed, his singing quartet came down to the boat, and they sang together. He was hoping that it would be a day as long as possible so he didn't have to leave. And on the 4th of July, I'll show you that this is what our page looks like, but he actually recorded multiple songs in his log. As steward, he wanted to show his patrioticity, so he made a mammoth plum pudding. Again, it's not his forte to spell, with raised letters on the dough, which read, when served on the table, perfectly plain, July 4th, 1857. Also a dish of baked mashed potatoes, ditto, So he wrote the date, the 4th of July, on both of these dishes. When they sat down to dinner in the cabin, the captain eyed them a moment and then asked what I had done there. I told him it was a sign of the times. And by the quantity which he caused to disappear, in an amazing short space of time, I thought he considered them a pretty substantial sign. So Haley is trying to be funny. In fact, he's writing this most likely as kind of a souvenir to bring back to his mother, father, brothers, sisters back in Bowdoin about his voyages around the Atlantic world. It's told in a very narrative and emotional way. And he also records all of these new experiences that maybe wouldn't have made it into a more official log. He talks about luscious, juicy, crisp pineapples. Imagine tasting a pineapple for the first time at the age of 25, just having your mind blown. He also talks about the passengers on board. For example, a cross baby about 8 months old who's voluminous and centaurian tones continually filled the cabin with heart-rending and jaw-cracking. So he was writing this as a narrative, and while he was funny at times, Haley also took quite a few pot shots throughout this book at basically everyone who was not his crew. Let's see, I have a list here. He makes sure to include insults about the Irish, the English, who he called the plainest looking set of girls I've ever seen, Black people, single women, Southeast Asian sailors, Jewish passengers because they wouldn't eat the hog he served because he was the cook and he did not observe kosher for them. He also saw a crew member dying violently and painfully of yellow fever while docked in Jamaica. So Haley is seeing the world. He's seeing its people. He's judging its people. He's just a 25-year-old guy who really did not enjoy being at sea. Close to the close of his sea journal, he records this entire song he wrote about how great it's going to be when he is home again. He dedicates it to his friends, and I'd like to think that when he got home, he sang it with his quartet. He did not go back to sea. He married a girl from Kennebunkport, moved to a farm. But H.M. Haley's journal is the most sea journal of sea journals. He very rarely discusses the weather, position, or anything official. He's very wrapped up in his own observations. Now, you might be wondering at this stage, are logbooks and sea journals always true? Were they ever falsified? The answer is, of course, yes, and there's actually a vocabulary word for it. In various naval services, that term is gun decking, supposedly because in navies under sail, midshipmen, officers in training, would be tasked with keeping a practice logbook so that they would be literate in keeping this very official document. But as teenagers do, they did not want to do their homework and might scuttle away to the gun deck, that narrow, dark place, and try and fill in the log, maybe cram to pass muster with the captain during their next inspection. Anyway, we don't have any verifiably gun-decked logs in our collection, but we do have some with some interesting mysteries and or surprises. So we're going to spend a minute or two looking at those, starting with one that is in our collection and on display in the Resounding exhibit right now. So this is the log of the brig Francis Anne. This is an 1846-49 log. It was a Maine-built vessel that left New York under the command of Captain William Tate. Now, we don't actually know if Tate's hand was the one that kept this logbook. Every page says William Tate, master, at the top. But as we've established, the mate was usually in charge of keeping the log. The handwriting is consistent throughout this log, but we don't know if this was actually Tate's hand. Now, the Francis Anne made many trips on this voyage, cataloged in this log, between Brazil and what's now Angola. And at the time, the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed by the United States. It was still legal to traffic enslaved people between ports in the United States, but bringing people from Africa to the United States was in fact a capital offense. But from the facts of this log, it seems very evident that that is exactly what the Francis Anne was doing. They were sailing back and forth between Brazil, a place that was known for its sugar plantations, where the life expectancy for a newly arrived enslaved person was incredibly low. Brazil still had legal slave trade and slave traders that would remunerate any country's flag vessel to bring them captive humans. The coast of Angola was known as the slave coast at the time. And the Francis Anne was actually chartered by a known slave trader in Brazil to do this work. Now, you will not see any mention of enslaved people as cargo in the log. So we don't actually have a written record of that being what the Francis Anne was doing, but historians, notably Dr. Kate McMahon from the Castine Historical Society, have looked into this log and put the pieces together to try and construct what it was doing. That's part of the work Atlantic Black Box is doing to recover lost histories of Black Mainers. But you'll see that there's this kind of strange vertical entry put alongside a regular logbook entry. Now, we'll see an example of this in a minute, but this is a section of the log that is technically a harbor log instead of taking place at sea, where navigation and position are very important. This is just the day-to-day operations of a vessel at anchor in the harbor, often reprovisioning, discharging, or loading cargo. But the master or mate, whoever is recording it, took this chance to record a really interesting passage. They say that they were boarded by the commander and sailing master of Her Majesty's gun brig Heroine. Now, both England and the United States not only had outlawed the transportation of enslaved people by vessels under their flags, but they also sent naval patrols out to try and stop this illegal trade. So a British Navy patrol boarded the Francis Anne. And it seems some words were exchanged. Finding they had committed an error by disputing the ship's clearing papers, the second lieutenant or lieutenant, since it's a British Navy ship, stated to the commander during the time he was on board he saw nothing but was legitimate and right. So it seems like there was previously some kind of accusation made by the British against the Francis Anne that was then cleared away. P.S. During the time command and sailing master was on board, they disputed the ship's registry and insulted the master, telling him it was false. So we don't have too much in the way of details about what this confrontation was like, but we do know that it didn't result in imprisonment, fine, or anything for the Francis Anne. They continued making this voyage. This specific leg of the voyage the logbook talks about sees them boarding passengers, but no cargo for the return leg to Brazil, at least according to the log. Now, the rest of this log looks fairly normal. There are shopping lists for things like timber and anchor chain. There's a bill of repair for work done on the coast of Angola, but there is nothing about the cargo or the people who were likely the cargo, and this is for a reason. Had the logbook been seized by the authorities and had it included mention of a human cargo, William Tate and his crew might have faced the death penalty, as other Maine slave traders did. We have another kind of mystery in front of us. This is the logbook of the schooner Edwin Hunt, and it's much later than most of the logbooks we're talking about today. The Hunt was a four-masted schooner built at the Deering Yard, so just right here. And its log is 99.9% normal, just regular observations about the weather and position, all of the things we've talked about until J.M. Borden, I don't know if they're a relation to me, seemed to trust that the ship's captain would not look at the log. So this is what he wrote when they reached port and he was discharged. There will be swearing. Remarks, 22nd day of July, 1914. Fine weather. Dried all sails. This is normal, marking on the weather. on what the crew was engaged in and furled them. Stevedores rigging at 3 p.m. Captain came on board to pay off crew. Crew wanted money before commissioner. Captain told them to take their money or go to hell. Crew went down to get their money. Captain put each man's money, made them sign clear, then knocked hell out of them, gave them their money, and let them go. Called me aft. Called me a son of a bitch, gave me 2 black eyes, and I think he has broke some of my ribs. Docked me $5 for subordination, gave me balance, made me sign clear, kicked my ass, made me get out of his cabin. I would take him to court, but good God, he would find me and kill me. Now, whosoever goes as mate in this vessel next, if you see this before you go to sea, get out. Don't go with him. But if too late, you have started on the voyage, let me advise you. You can't treat this man as the general run of coasters. He is an old blank man. He is engineer, mate, second mate, cook, and sailor, and takes no bluff from any man. He works from daylight to dark, and if you don't keep busy, God help you. So beware if he ever hits you. His fist is like the hoof of a mule. Thank God I'm clear of him. But J.M. Borden wasn't done. He continued on to the next page. A little more advice before I close. Keep your sailors working. Let no man aloof. If you do, it is hell to pay. You plenty to eat, but what's the good? He takes it all out of you with work. And work. I must take my duds and get before he catches me at this. I would not want to be within 100 miles of Boston when he sees this. Still, give the devil his due. If you know your business and work like hell, you will never go with a better man than Charles Gilbert, the Texas cowboy captain. J.M. Borden, mate for 36, the most miserable days of my life. So this is the kind of thing that you might find if you dive in to those hundreds of logbooks that haven't really been cataloged or studied at the museum. Looking at this page, and I'll go back one, this, if you didn't actually take the time to read it, would look like just a normal harbor log, but no, it is a dire warning for the next mate on board. I don't know if the captain found this or what the next mate found. Did he decide to run? Or was it too late? Did he have to deal with that violent captain? We will never know. And that's just an interesting thought, that these logbooks and sea journals give us so much information, but there's also a lot that's not written down. When I do this with students, I talk about how what's written is what gets remembered. If you don't write about yourself and your history, if you don't keep a record, who's to say you're right? Who's to say what happened? Who's to say what you experienced? So while this logbook opens up more questions than answers to me, I do think it's a really interesting object to be in our museum and to be a part of the history of this place. There are a couple of other mysterious or otherwise very interesting stories that we do not have time to talk about today because each of these is their own lecture, but I'll briefly state that Emily St. Pierre was a Confederate blockade runner that was captured by a Union revenue cutter. And then the crew, which was just 2 men left on board from the Confederate blockade runner crew, then retook the vessel from the Union and sailed it to England, which was a friend to the Confederacy. And you can read the log about that at our museum. We also have the schooner Siren, about the size of Mary E., a vessel that did take a cargo of enslaved people. In 1795, Richard right here transcribed it, and you can read all about that as well as the various mysteries surrounding it. There are missing pages. There was a violent French man. They were also boarded by a revenue cutter. All of these logs or sea journals, I mean, the Sirens is a log, but you can see that it was kept pretty informally. There's no table of locations there. All these stories are in these logbooks. They're there for the reading. Of course, I would be remiss if we didn't look at all of the non-writing things you can do with a logbook. Briefly, we have a log from the mate on the ship India. This was clearly a personal log, and I'll show you why. First of all, here's how he started the voyage. Look at how nice that is. Look at how he's very kind of circumspect, doesn't write a whole lot under remarks. But then, some months into the voyage, he starts just writing all over the place. He's primarily reflecting on crew members getting sick on the ship Stacy. By the end of the voyage, he's just doodling in the margins, editorializing away. We can see that this mate was writing this not for the official record, but for himself. And it goes from strict logbook to strict sea journal by the end with beautiful illustrations. Like, look at these. This is the front and back page of his logbook. We think that this one right here is actually a cartoon of himself, the mate. It's captioned, "Coming alongside." And though it's hard to read, he is swearing at someone in this speech bubble. He's telling them to catch the damn rope because he's going to throw it to them so the vessel can tie up. And then he drew a beautiful dancing girl on the other page. That's quite a lot of detail. But Charles J. Rogers, the mate, was clearly not going to turn this logbook, which is a logbook and was in fact printed. I'm going to go back a page, maybe. I thought I had this pop up, but this logbook was actually printed as stationer in Bath as a logbook, and he used it for all sorts of artistic purposes. He drew all the vessels they sighted, and there's actually a photo of one of these vessels. Here is his drawing of this vessel. It was re-rigged as a bark by the time this photo was taken, but you can see that he actually did a great job illustrating the vessels he saw in a way that was completely antithetical to what this logbook was meant to be used for. Lastly, our last big example, and potentially my favorite, is a diary kept on the ship Flyaway. And much like with the last log diary we looked at from the ship India, this is a logbook diary that shows maturation. So Rufus Sewell of the Bath Sewells was 13 years old when he was sent to sea on this clipper ship. This is a New York-built clipper ship, incredibly fast, and his uncle Merrill Sewell was the master. So small Rufus gets sent to sea. He keeps a log in this just kind of blank paper book that he has done sums on about how many years have elapsed. And this is what he writes. So here's very soon after embarkation in 1857, August 17th. This morning, I got up and went on deck before 5 o'clock and helped them wash the deck down. Imagine a 13-year-old doing that. He'd be so proud. Rufus is proud. And it made me have a good appetite for my breakfast. Uncle Merrill is trying to learn me to take the sun. I washed some of my clothes. There is not much wind today, and it is from the west. No sails in sight today. You can tell he's paying attention. He's listening to what his Uncle Merrill is talking about, but he's just a regular 13-year-old kid doing chores, eating, learning. Just about less than a week later, he's already starting to pick up on logbook writing. August 23rd, there is not much wind today, and the ship does not move very fast. It is very hot on deck today, so I thought I would try a sailor's fashion, and I like it very much. It is to go barefooted. No sails in sight today, wind from the northwest, and then, clearly following what his uncle is doing, the uncle that was trying to teach him celestial navigation, he gives latitude, longitude, course, air, and water temperature, as well as the barometer. Reading, he's starting to pick up on what the sailors around him are doing. And by October, his handwriting is barely legible. They're off the horn. He does not want to be writing in this log. He wants to be up on deck, crawling around in the rigging. The second mate has made him a pair of duck pants so that he can easily work with the sailors. He's learned how to plate Senate. He's learned how to use the sextant for celestial navigation. He just tells us that this day commenced with strong southwest gales inside of land, 15 miles, 2 ships in sight. This little man has become a sailor. He also, of course, was still a 13-year-old boy, so he writes about how it's very pleasant today, and I have been at work scraping iron, and it is nasty work. And then the next day, this morning, I had my watch below, and Aunt Mary, that's Uncle Merrill's wife, made me write a composition, and I had, for the subject, scraping iron. So he's still in school. He wants to be a sailor, but he is still having to write essays. And I love this. I love that in our collection we have this day-to-day account of what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy of privilege at sea, seeing all of this for the first time, learning so much. It's a pretty unvarnished account. It also does have mysteries with it. In one of his very first entries, he talks about how they're in the Gulf Stream today and the winds from the east, and he is not at all seasick, but Mr. Pickles is rather seasick. I'm going to leave our logbook and sea journal investigations with this. Who's Mr. Pickles? He doesn't come up.
Sickles.
Yeah, I think Sickles. I have looked, maybe it's Mr. Sickles, but I have seen no other mentions of Mr. Pickles or Sickles, and his capital S's look different, Richard.
Well, that's not an unusual thing. You will see that even on clock faces. The S's are done that way.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was Sickles, but we have this character who enters and never comes back. They're sick. All right, briefly, modern logbooks. I wanted to share with you, there are many different ways to keep modern logbook. This is a page from the Mary Mead's logbook, the museum's vessel, and you'll notice that they are not recording latitude, longitude, winds, or even much in the way of remarks. There's a place for comments, but they're primarily concerned about the engines, of course, and about passengers. Any modern vessel, even a modern sailing vessel, is probably going to keep an engine log for anything else. This is the thing that has supplanted the attitude of the sails, the weather, the wind, and position. That's the most important thing to log. So what? I hope this has inspired you somewhat to want to write down your own experiences or draw your own experiences, as the case may be, even just in kind of a spreadsheet format. What you can do if you want to access this collection of almost 500 logbooks, many of which have never been studied deeply, you can do so by going to mainmaritimemuseum.org/collection. Go to the Internet Archive page, and for free, you can read hundreds of these in a really high quality internet viewer. There are some transcriptions available, but all of them are right there on the internet for you. And our curatorial team is currently working on getting even more available to you. You can also email library@maritimeme.org. If you're someone, especially, and there are lots of volunteers with us today, if you're someone who wants to dive deep into these, ask Kelly, ask if you can come and be a curatorial volunteer. Logbooks are one of the things that curatorial volunteers are working on right now. Besides what you can do here at Maine Maritime Museum, I wanted to briefly mention that there's some incredible history work being done with logbooks. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, UMass Dartmouth, and the Providence Public Library, which has an archive of over 5,000 whaling logbooks, are actually working together to do forensic meteorology. They're reading these logbooks and very, very closely mapping what the weather was like in specific locations throughout these whaling voyages, because there isn't data for most of human history about these remote places, often in the middle of the ocean where there's no human habitation. But whaling voyages went so many distant places and were out for such long periods of time, leaving incredibly detailed trails of data, that this is something that can tell us a lot about our modern climate, how much it's changed, or if this is something that is familiar from other times. So getting kind of a history of what weather has been like in all parts of the globe is something that logbooks are directly contributing to right now. So what will you write about next time you write about yourself? And remember, when in doubt, there's always the weather.